we're not used to wearing masks in the West. And part of the reason I decided to finally make this video is I had a friend ask me about it. And a friend was asking, hey, I've been jogging on a trail and I see people wearing masks and we're all staying 6 feet away from each other anyway. Isn't that silly? Why are they wearing a mask? It's ridiculous. Well, no, it's not. The risk is not zero at 6 feet away. And if you wear a mask and you can further reduce the chance of you infecting other people, that's great. There's really no reason not to wear the mask other than that we have a stigma about it. So in many countries in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, there is no stigma about that. It's actually kind of part of the culture that if you feel like you might be sick, even if you're not sick, or even if you have allergies, you're coughing, for the sake of other people's comfort and for the sake of not spreading diseases, you should wear a mask in public. It's not unusual to see people in public transit, in the grocery store, wearing a mask everywhere you go. Nobody looks at them funny or thinks they're weird. It's just being polite. It would be really good if we could get to that point here where we understand that my wearing a mask doesn't make me weird. I shouldn't take it off because I don't need it, and so therefore if I don't need it, I'm wearing it, I'm being weird. Instead, it's just I'm being polite and helping out other people by putting on a mask. Another reason for that is because of the reasons I mentioned before. Every time you put it on and take it off and every time you touch it, there is a small chance, but there is a chance of causing increased transmission. So the best thing you can do with it is put it on, leave it alone, and don't touch it, right? So let's say I go into the grocery store, I come close to a person, I've got my mask on, that's good. Now I'm walking alone to go to my car to the next store. Do I take it off and then put it back on? No, why not just leave it on? It's not a big deal. Just get used to wearing it. Get used to seeing other people wearing it. It doesn't mean they're criminal, it just means they're trying to be polite. The less you touch it and take it off and put it on, the better off you are, and the more you just get used to wearing it. It's not a big deal. When I wear this, if you notice, when I breathe in, it does touch my lips a little bit. Don't get too caught up about that. It's not a super big deal, but at the same time, you don't really want your mask resting on your mouth and nose perfectly. There should be a little bit of airspace most of the time. It works a little bit better that way. Different types of masks. So in addition to these surgical masks, we have N95 masks. And people aren't really encouraging N95 masks outside of the hospital, mostly because of the fact that they're hard to come by and we don't want people using them up. But also because an N95 mask, in order to actually work as an N95 mask, has to fit a certain way. This mask is only designed, mostly it's designed to prevent me from giving somebody else an infection. It does have some protection to prevent me from getting one from someone else, but air escapes around the edges. It's not meant to stop airborne particles. It's tiny little particles that are airborne that float around the air. It's meant to stop droplets mostly. This one is meant to stop tiny particles, and it's N95 because it blocks 95% of particles of a certain size, and hopefully the virus is bigger than that size and you get something closer to 100%. So when I put this on, that comes in different sizes rather than this is one size fits all. They come in different sizes, and ideally, if you're using this at work, it has to be fitted to you. There's a certain process using either Bitrix or saccharin, where you put this on, and you've got to put a little hood over your head, and somebody sprays this stuff, and you breathe in through your mouth, and if you taste it, then that means the particles the size of that aerosol are getting into your mouth, which means the mask fails. And so you do different things. You move your head around, you touch the edge of the thing, you talk, they have you read a little poem. And at the end of all that, if you taste whatever they're doing, whether it's sweet, the saccharin, or bitter because it's the Bitrix, then the mask fails. You have to try a different mask. And sometimes you have to go through several different masks to find the mask that fits. Well, people out on the streets aren't going through that. Some people who work outside of healthcare, if you work with toxic materials, toxic chemicals, you probably do know that process because it's the same process. But most people on the street are not going to get maximum benefit out of an N95 because it's not going to be fitted. Also, the N95, because all of the air goes in and out through the N95, unlike this mask, this gets you have to get used to this. It does cause you to rebreathe a certain amount of CO2. It can make you feel short of breath. It does create some resistance when you blow out. It creates some resistance when you pull in. You can kind of forget about it after a while, but most people get a little bit claustrophobic. And my concern with that is when you start getting a little bit claustrophobic or start getting hard to breathe, you're more likely to make those mistakes that I talked about earlier, which is to grab the mask, move it out of the way, push it back, move it around the edges, do all those other kinds of terrible things. Sometimes people get a runny nose. Sometimes people start getting a little bit of phlegm because they're wearing this mask and they have that resistance and it irritates their linings, whatever happens. Then you get paranoid, you start thinking you have disease, nobody wants that. Also, if you're creating more mucus and more phlegm and more moisture because of the fact that this gives you the sniffles, then that's an increased opportunity for transmission if you happen to be an asymptomatic infected person. This is another style. This is a style We tend to like these in the hospital because they fit a lot of people, more so than these do as far as getting a seal. These are just as good when they're rated N95. This is a 3M version, which is a pretty nice mask. Kimberly Clark makes these, a couple other make these too, but these are popular because they're cheap, and they also pack flat, which means when you're going through hundreds of them a day, under normal circumstances before COVID-19, if we only use these for airborne, we don't use these for things like flu. If somebody had, say, tuberculosis, that's the most common thing, or if we thought they might have tuberculosis, we put them in a special room where the air doesn't come out of the room. It's called a negative airflow room. And when we go into the room, because these particles are assumed to be floating around in the room, just hanging out there, not on droplets, but actually floating in the air, we wear this kind of mask. When you leave, you throw it away. When you come back in the room, you get a new one. You always get a new one every time, normally, under those circumstances. Now, we don't have that luxury now, so we are reusing these, which means that, again, because every amount of air that you are breathing is being pulled through this filter, the outside of this filter becomes very, very dirty, or the inside of this filter becomes very, very dirty if you happen to be infected. Then when you handle the mask, you create more problems. So there's other videos, I'm not going to try to do the whole thing, about how to take this off and put this on in a way that you don't touch the bad parts of it or touch your face with it. I want to add one more piece, which is anytime you put on or take off a mask, if you have the opportunity to wash your hands or use hand sanitizer before and after, do that. Because, again, one of the problems with masks is touching it with your hands and then your hands touching your face. Also, just please don't touch your face. I was told I should try looking at the hand sanitizer. So this is another topic that there's some confusion about. Anything with alcohol that's more than about 40 or 50% is going to help. 90% will kill the virus, but the optimal percentage, according to, again, just Chinese research, 70 to 75% alcohol, even 65% alcohol is ideal because of the way water and alcohol and the surface of the virus interact. That gives you the maximum amount of killing the virus in the shortest amount of time. However, other concentrations of alcohol will still kill the virus. They just require more what's called wet time. And that's really what I'm trying to talk about, is every disinfectant that's used to disinfect a surface requires what's called wet time. It doesn't work by, it's not like paint. You don't spread it over it and everything that it touches is immediately sanitized. That's not how it works. The way alcohol works is it damages the layer and dries out the surface. So if I take a tiny drop of hand sanitizer, boop, and I just move it around, my hands are not sanitized. I need a little more than that, probably about this much. Enough that when I rub my hands together, all of the surfaces of my hands are damp. They don't have to be soaking wet, they don't have to be dripping, but they all have to be damp. I can actually feel the moisture. And then it needs to take at least 5 or 10 seconds to dry. So if there's not enough sanitizer on here to take 5 or 10 seconds to dry, then I haven't put enough hand sanitizer on to actually clean my hands effectively. My beautiful fiance mentioned that this one is from Bath and Body Works, and it's got little bits of beads or glitter or whatever in it, and some people are saying this doesn't work. It works, okay? It's still 68% alcohol, which is the optimal amount of alcohol to have. And even if it was 55% or 80%, as long as you use it appropriately and you use the right amount to dampen your hands, you can hear it wetting all of the surfaces, and then allow it to dry. And you can rub your hands until they dry, so it dries faster, but either way, they need to be wet for several seconds. Then you've accomplished your task. Hey sweetie, how's it going? Also, what do I do with this mask when we're done with it? Or if I'm going to reuse it, because a lot of us are reusing masks now. You notice I touched the ear loops, the least contaminated part of this. I can set this aside. If I leave it for about 10 days in a dry air, it should be totally safe, right? Because hopefully it doesn't last longer than that. And everything we know says maybe 4 days, maybe 8 days, but definitely not longer. That's one thing you can do, is just leave it alone and don't touch it. Heat can be used for disinfection, but the problem with heat is you can melt the fibers and make the mask less effective. What I'm reading tells me that anything above about 130 to 140 degrees for more than 10 minutes makes something safe. That's well below the temperature of boiling water. What I personally do, these are all masks that I've used more than once already at work, and then I bring them home and then I've got to wear them again, and I bring them back and I wear them, except for this one I bought at the hardware store before this all started. And what I do most of the time is because I live in Florida, I leave them in the car on the dashboard. I leave the windows rolled up and I park in the sun. And I know while I'm sleeping, because I work night shift, when I come out the next day, it's gotten above 130 degrees on my dashboard. And they've been sitting out there baking in the sun for 8 hours, and I feel pretty safe picking them up, using them again. That's my level of safety. Some people have talked about a microwave. Microwave's a terrible idea. First off, microwaves only heat up water. And if there's no water in the mask, you're not really heating up the mask. You're heating up the area around it. And the microwaves themselves don't kill the virus. The heat does. If you try to put water in there, you're asking for trouble, and it's very easy to overheat things. And if you melt these fibers, they lose a lot of their effectiveness. They lose their charge when they start to glom together. They lose the ability to trap viruses. So you don't want to overheat it. Hair dryer is a bad idea, not because it doesn't work, but because literally you're drying out potential viruses and you're blowing them. You don't want to. The whole idea is you don't want to blow them into the air. So don't use a hair dryer. There's some talk about UV light. Not all UV light is created equal. If you happen to have a sanitizing UVC light, like the type that they put in air conditioning systems to prevent mold from growing on the coils, or that you use for sanitizing surfaces, that's perfectly fine. Use the manufacturer direction. I made the mistake of buying a big 60-watt one, which puts out so much UV that I only need to run it for about 2 minutes, and then I don't have a timer for 2 minutes, and I don't want to overdo it because the UV will actually break down the mask, whatever, it's a thing. But UV light does help. On my dashboard, the UV light from the sun doesn't really work that well because the most important part of the UV light is blocked by my windshield, so I'm not getting UV benefit. If I left it out exposed directly to the sun all day, that would probably be enough sunlight to make it pretty safe. There's a lot of ways to make it safe. The Chinese put out some guides on reusing masks that I think are pretty good. They talked about this particular material, this melt-blown polyethylene, being the best material that they tested on actual COVID. They also said you can disinfect this using moderate heat, 140 degrees or less. You can disinfect it using UV. You can disinfect it using alcohol. If you pour alcohol on it and let it dry, that's all it takes. Once it's dry, it's safe. You should not use soap and water. And the reason they don't want you to use soap and water is because they found that soap and water does disinfect the mask, but it also breaks the surface tension and causes the material to lose its static charge, which makes it less effective at filtering the virus. They said if you use alcohol or heat, you can reuse this mask 8, 10, 12 times and it doesn't really lose much effectiveness. But if you wash it with soap and water once, you've decreased its effectiveness. That's no good. Last thing, the University of Florida mask. My friend Alex sent me this one that they sewed. This is a material which is made out of that same melt-blown polyethylene that is designed for wrapping instruments when they go into a sterilizer. So it's designed to deal with heat above 212 degrees because it's a pressurized boil, steam. And it's fairly thick, and it works pretty well. It's probably filters much more effectively even than the standard surgical mask does, because it's a tighter, bigger, thicker material. It's a little bit harder to breathe through, but not as hard as an N95. The N95s mostly have a carbon layer in them too to help with smells in addition to viruses. We don't care about that. This doesn't have the carbon layer, so it's not going to block smells. And this is reusable and washable. Again, soap does moderately decrease the effectiveness, but still you can clean it. You reuse it multiple times. Ties on. These are great. This material is made by Halyard. This is H600. I think H400 would work just as well. Hospitals throw this away all the time. There's not a shortage of it. So that's, if you're making homemade masks, something good to consider. Look up University of Florida masks and on YouTube, and you can find a lot of good information on that. Oh, I forgot to mention, don't share a mask. Don't put something. I actually had people offering me their masks.
I got it.
Hey, honey, I'm going to the store.
Well, no, wait, cut. Virtual cut. I'm confident.
Oh, hey, honey, I'm going to the store.
Oh, you can't forget this. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come get it. I'm so